The idea of medieval dungeons has captured the imagination for centuries. When most people hear the word dungeon, they instantly picture a dark stone cell, deep underground, with rusty chains on the walls, skeletal remains scattered across the floor, and rats scurrying through pools of foul water. In the collective imagination, dungeons were horrifying places where prisoners were tortured in unspeakable ways, often just for the amusement of cruel rulers or inquisitors. But how accurate is this chilling image? Did dungeons really resemble horror movie sets? Or have modern myths distorted what these places were really like? The truth, as with most things in history, is more complex and often stranger than fiction. Let us begin with the word itself. The term dungeon comes from the French word dungeon, which referred to the main tower or keep of a castle. Ironically, the original dungeon was not where prisoners were kept. Instead, it was the strongest part of the castle and usually housed the lord's family, or acted as a last line of defense in case of siege. Over time, the word evolved in English to mean a dark prison cell located beneath a castle. But this was more of a romantic and literary transformation than a reflection of how castles were actually built or used. In medieval Europe, keeping prisoners locked up for extended periods wasn't usually the go-to punishment. Prison was not yet viewed as a standard form of criminal justice. If someone committed a crime, they were far more likely to be fined, publicly shamed, mutilated, or executed than kept in long-term confinement. Prisons existed, of course, but they served more as temporary holding areas until someone's case could be heard in court or until a ransom was paid. This alone already contradicts the modern myth that thousands of people were rotting away in chains in castle basements across the continent. That said, some castles did have prison cells, often located in towers or occasionally in underground rooms. These spaces could be unpleasant, certainly. Some were little more than storage areas converted to keep people from escaping. There were instances where prisoners were thrown into oubliettes, small vertical shafts with no door, only an opening at the top. The name comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. These shafts were usually so narrow that a prisoner couldn't lie down. But despite the gruesome sound of it, oubliettes were extremely rare. And many of the ones that tour guides claim were used to hold prisoners were actually waste shafts or water wells. In fact, many so-called torture chambers in castles today were repurposed or romanticized. During the 18th and 19th centuries, when Gothic horror and medieval revivalism were all the rage, this brings us to another widely held belief that medieval dungeons were primarily torture centers. While it's true that torture was used in medieval Europe, it was not as widespread or as routine as pop culture often suggests. The use of torture was often heavily regulated by law. It was usually limited to extracting confessions in high-profile cases like heresy or treason. In England, for example, torture was technically illegal unless authorized by the monarch or privy council. In many parts of Europe, it could only be used after a judge had determined there was sufficient evidence to justify it. Even then, torturers had to follow strict procedures. As strange as it sounds, there were bureaucratic limits to brutality. That said, medieval punishments could be incredibly cruel. Breaking on the wheel, flaying, boiling alive, or having limbs removed were gruesome methods reserved for the most severe crimes. But these punishments were generally carried out in public, not in the secret darkness of a dungeon. Public punishment was part of a strategy of deterrence. The goal was to scare others into obedience, and that couldn't happen if the punishment was hidden away underground. Executions, floggings, and mutilations often took place in town squares, not in shadowy castle corners. Another myth concerns the idea that innocent people were constantly being thrown into dungeons for no reason, held there for years without trial. While miscarriages of justice certainly occurred, and power was often abused, the legal systems of medieval Europe were more sophisticated than they are often given credit for. Courts existed at multiple levels, and there were rules, procedures, and even appeals in some jurisdictions. Nobles could demand trial by their peers. Commoners could bring complaints against lords, though their chances of winning were slim. Justice was uneven, yes, but it was not entirely lawless. Moreover, prisoners in castles were often high-status individuals. Common criminals were rarely worth the trouble of long imprisonment. But nobles captured in war or conflict could be incredibly valuable. They were often held under what was called house arrest, allowed to roam parts of the castle or estate with servants and decent food, until their family or liege paid a hefty ransom. Some even lived relatively well while in captivity, using the time to write poetry, make political alliances, or conduct secret correspondence. These political prisoners might never see a dungeon at all in the classic sense. The enduring imagery of medieval dungeons owes much to later centuries, particularly the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods. When writers and artists painted the Middle Ages as a dark and barbaric time, the phrase Dark Ages was popularized to contrast the intellectual stagnation of the medieval period with the brilliance of the Greco-Roman world and the Renaissance that followed. During this time, tales of cruel inquisitors, iron maidens, and blood-stained torture devices began to proliferate. Many of these were exaggerated or entirely invented. Take the infamous Iron Maiden, for example, a spiked coffin supposedly used to torture victims to death. Historians widely agree that the Iron Maiden never existed in the Middle Ages. The most famous example, located in Nuremberg, was actually constructed in the 18th or 19th century as a museum piece. The same goes for many racks, wheels, and other devices we associate with medieval cruelty. They were often constructed later as part of a theatrical retelling of history meant to shock or entertain rather than educate. Modern-day tours of castles across Europe frequently play into these myths. Visitors expect dungeons, so curators provide them. Stone rooms with bars or manacles are designated as dungeons, even if they originally served entirely different purposes such as food storage, wine cellars, or servants' quarters. Dark lighting, ambient screams, and mannequins wearing hoods and wielding tongs all help feed the fantasy. But this tells us more about our modern obsession with medieval horror than it does about the truth of life in the Middle Ages. Still, this is not to suggest that medieval prisons were pleasant. For those who did find themselves confined, conditions could be miserable. Overcrowding, filth, disease, and neglect were common. Jailers often expected bribes in exchange for food or better treatment. Sanitation was primitive at best. But again, the reality is that these conditions were more typical of urban prisons, not castle dungeons. Town jails and ecclesiastical prisons were where most lower-class criminals ended up, not some gloomy stone chamber beneath a fortress. It is also important to remember that not all dungeons were places of suffering. In some castles, what we now call a dungeon was simply a storeroom or a secure room used for safekeeping documents, treasure, or even guests during times of danger. The transformation of these spaces into dungeons in the popular mind is largely the result of literature and film, especially Gothic novels of the 18th century and horror movies of the 20th. In the end, medieval dungeons are a powerful symbol more than a historical reality. They represent our fascination with cruelty, power, and the unknown. They reflect our fears of injustice, of being trapped, forgotten, and helpless. But to truly understand the medieval world, we need to set aside these dramatic images and look at the more nuanced, often less theatrical truth. Medieval justice was harsh, but it was also structured. Prisons existed, but they were not always dungeons. Torture happened, but it was not as casual or routine as legend suggests. By separating myth from reality, we not only gain a clearer picture of the past, but also learn to question the stories we inherit. The dungeon, as we imagine it, is more a product of our own fears than a faithful reflection of history. And perhaps that tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the Middle Ages. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the mysterious world of medieval dungeons. As we've discovered, the shadowy images we often see in movies and hear about in old legends do always hold up to the light of real history. While there were dark corners and grim punishments in the medieval world, the truth is far more layered and fascinating than the myths. Dungeons were not just chambers of horror, but part of a larger and surprisingly complex system of justice, politics, and power. If this video challenged what you thought you knew, that's the beauty of exploring history with an open mind. The real stories are often even more intriguing than the made-up ones. So the next time you see a rusty chain on a castle wall, or hear about an infamous torture chamber, you might just think twice about what really went on there. If you enjoyed this dive into fact versus fiction, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. There's always more to uncover, and together, we'll keep separating the real past from the stories we've been told.
Oh.
Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning.